Hello, welcome to the weekly Thursday lecture from EducationUSA. Good afternoon or good morning if you are in different time zone. My name is Yulia Piskorska. I'm EducationUSA Special Projects Coordinator, and I will be moderating this webinar. Today, we will talk about the opportunities to work in the US through OPT and CPT. And if you don't know what OPT or CPT means, by the end of this webinar, you will. Often we receive questions from students like whether the international students are eligible to work while studying, if yes, how many hours, and what type of opportunities are available. Today, you will receive answers for all of these questions, and if you have more, please leave your questions in the comment section, and I will make sure to address them in the end of the presentation. And now I'm pleased to introduce two guest speakers that will share their expertise with you. It's Kara LaSota, the Director of International Student and Scholar Services at the University of Northern Colorado, and Olga Baron, the Executive Director of the Center of International Education at the University of Colorado. Olga, Kara, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're delighted to share some time with you this evening for you, this morning for us. Olga, do you want to say hi?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. Добрий день. Дякую вам за те, що ви з нами сьогодні. Мене звати Ольга Барон. My name is Olga Baron. I thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we have an informative and hopefully educational presentation for you today. We welcome your questions, your comments. Please stay with us, and thanks again for joining. Kara, go ahead.
If we could turn on the PowerPoint slides, that would be helpful. Wonderful, thank you. So we're going to talk about CPT, OPT, and other employment opportunities in the United States today. So there are several. It is limited, but I thought it would be useful to go beyond just practical training. So just so you know who we are, we're from the University of Northern Colorado, which is in Northern Colorado, obviously, but we're very near mountains and lakes, and it's really a beautiful area. We're also about an hour away from Denver, which is one of the premier cities in the US, but Greeley itself, where we are, is a small city. So it's a nice balance of near sophisticated big city, but a smaller city where you can actually get to know people. We have a small sense of community rather than a big university where you get lost. So it's a nice place to be able to get to know your professors, and that also means more opportunities for employment than some other universities have. We're very much believers in hands-on education, which means practical training opportunities for students. And we have very highly effective professors, which we're terribly proud of. So we're going to talk about several areas of employment today. I didn't want to limit this to just practical training because that's not always paid employment. I wanted to give you a broad sense of how this works in the US and what happens sometimes after you graduate, because that's a really common question. So we're going to talk about several different things. The primary focus will be on CPT and OPT, and we'll talk about exactly what those are, but there's some words you need to know before we start this that may be unfamiliar. So the Department of Homeland Security kind of owns most of immigration for F1 students, which is how most students come to the US. The Student and Exchange Visitor Program, or SEVP, owns the database that we use to report on students. We use it to issue immigration support documents. It's how you get your visa, is with those immigration support documents called an I-20. That's something that's only issued by a designated school official, or DSO. I'm our principal designated school official on our campus, and Olga is one of our designated school officials as well. And then US Citizenship and Immigration Services provides certain benefits to students that a DSO cannot. So other important terms are your Employment Authorization Document, or EAD, which applies to some kind of work permissions. And then I just want to mention that in the US, we use the words school, college, and university very interchangeably. Generally, when you're talking to someone who works in higher education, universities in the US, you'll hear us use all three words and we mean the same thing. We generally mean university level studies, whether it's undergraduate, bachelor's, master's, PhD. And then the last thing I want to mention is the definition of employment, because it's really important to this conversation. So for employment, an employee is someone who provides services or labor for wages or other remuneration. So it's not just your standard employer who gives you a paycheck once a week or twice a week, whatever it is. It is anything that is this for that. I do something for you, you give me something of value back. And the reason that this is important is because employment opportunities in the US are actually very, very limited. And it's important that you understand that even casual employment is not allowed unless you have permission either from a designated school official like me or from the US government. And it's not easy to come by in all circumstances. So it's important to know when you're thinking about financing your US education that you shouldn't plan on financing it from money earned inside the US. It generally is not permitted, because that's why you actually have to show financial documents when you are requesting the support documents to get your visa, and actually when you go in for your visa appointment. Because the US government takes this so seriously, it is one of the things that can cause you to literally be deported from the US if you have worked illegally. So it's important that you pay attention to that part. There is a lot of information online from the US government. Some of it is a little challenging to get through just because there's so much, but Study in the States is one of the best resources for students out there. So the first thing I want to talk about in terms of employment in the US, and this is very, very common, is campus employment. So for many students, this actually is a major part of their time in the USA. There's more than one kind of campus employment. So you can work for a university department or office, or the dining hall, or the residence hall. So for instance, in our office, we hire students in several ways. We hire students who are driving other students to events. We hire students who are supporting students who want to study abroad. So we hire different students for that. There's graduate assistantship. So if you are doing a master's or a PhD in the US, this actually is a way you can finance your degree while working in the US. So many graduate assistantships pay for tuition and sometimes even a stipend to live on. So that can be a way to finance, if not your whole education, a major part of it at the graduate level. And then there's campus vendors. So some universities have commercial companies that come and have a site on our campus. So for instance, in our office, we have a bagel restaurant right across from our office and a Subway sandwiches right next door. Those are both commercial firms, but students, international students, can work at those commercial firms as long as they're on campus. For any kind of on-campus employment, the limitation while school is in session, whether you're a semester school, trimester school, quarter school, when classes are in session, you can only work 20 hours a week. When classes are not in session during official vacations, official breaks, then it is as many hours as you can, which depends on campus protocols. So some schools limit students to working 20 to 30 hours a week, no matter when in the year it is. Some schools will say if it's during the break, you can work as many hours as jobs you can get, because there aren't enough students on campus during the breaks to cover all the things that students often do for campuses. For any on-campus employment, the last day you are allowed to do this is the last day of classes in your final term. So it's based on being an actual student at the university. So that's important to know. If you have a graduate assistantship and you go on to practical training, then you may be able to carry over that graduate assistantship in some cases because there are some special provisions of optional practical training that may apply to you. So for all of these, you need to be here in valid F1 status. So that means you have to have your visa, you have to get here, and you have to follow all the rules of the F1 visa category. And you should get an orientation when you're at your university that talks about what those rules are and how they work at that particular school. The one exception to campus vendors that's important to know is campus vendors need to be serving students. So you might be on a campus where they're building a new gymnasium or a new residence hall. You're not allowed to do construction on campus. Whatever it is, even if it's a commercial firm that's working on campus, it has to serve students. So many of us have, like I said, restaurants on campus that are owned by a corporation. Bookstores are very common, things like that, because they're serving students. If it is an organization that's just renting space on campus, then that doesn't count as campus employment. The other thing that can count as campus employment that's not listed here is off campus, which is considered on campus, which is confusing. But if it is tied to research at the graduate level, and it's a tie for the whole university to, let's say, a commercial research firm, that sometimes can count as campus employment. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone. We'll go over questions here at the end, but I am happy to answer them. Also, off-campus employment can include working for an international organization. I will be very honest. I have been working in this field for 18 years. I have never had a student do this because the list is very specific. For the most part, the jobs are very specific, but it is possible. You can maintain your F1 status and be approved even for full-time employment. But it is only a very specific list of international organizations that you can work for. They essentially need to sponsor you for this opportunity. But for instance, some schools, say in New York, might have some connections with some of these organizations, or a school in Alaska. I know that the Pacific Fisheries Commission is one of those organizations, and there's a lot of connections in Alaska. So that is something you can look into. Another potential employment opportunity off campus, this is very, very limited, but I want you to know that it exists in an emergency. So if you have been here for 1 year, enrolled full-time, and you have planned to not need to work while you're in the United States, and there is a disaster in your home country, or there's an illness in your family, something happens that you could not have seen, then it is possible to apply for off-campus work permission to work at any job, anywhere, part-time while school is in session, full-time when it's not, to help finance your studies. It does go through the U.S. government. It goes through that U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services Office. It's slow to get, but in an emergency, it can help you save your education in ways that there's almost no other way to do while you're here. So it's not something you ever want to plan on using, and I hope none of you ever are in the position to need it, but know that it's there, and you should talk to your international student advisor about it if something happens after you're here. Okay, so what is practical training? That's the thing we're all here really to talk about today, right? So practical training is your chance to work in your field of study, to get experience, to get your feet on the ground, as we say. It may include paid or unpaid. So employment in immigration terms is not always employment for money. Sometimes it's an activity that you do that gives you experience in your field. So that's considered employment sometimes too. In some cases, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services does the authorization. In other cases, the schools do, and that's always a designated school official like myself or like Olga. Okay. It is not available to students in intensive English programs. So it is only once you're an academic student that you have the opportunity to do practical training. All this talking gets me a little bit dry. So we'll talk about curricular practical training first, and there's a reason for that. So when we talk about CPT, it's really important that we use the word curricular and think about what that means. That means attached to your actual academic curriculum. So it is a requirement for a class or for your program. So you're going to get credit for that engagement. Sometimes it's paid, sometimes it's not paid. There's no limit on the total amount that you can do by law, but because it is curricular, because it's attached to your academic studies, it has to do with the university policy. How many internships are you allowed to get credit for? Is internship allowed for your program? Some programs have an internship and externship, clinical rotations, and something else. I know that we have one program that has, I think, 5 distinct practical training requirements for the program. For most of our undergraduate programs, there are fewer required practical training opportunities, but there's an internship class that's an option. And because you get credit for it, I can authorize curricular practical training. Generally, the cost involved is really the cost of the class or the academic program. So depends on the school because we all work a little bit differently. Some may have a curricular practical training fee. We do not. But in most cases, it's attached to your actual academic fees. CPT must happen while you are still a student. So the start of your potential authorization is after you've been here 1 year, unless you're a graduate student and your graduate program requires it to start earlier. The last possible day of curricular practical training authorization would be the last day of classes in your final term, a lot like on-campus employment. It requires you to be a student because it's curricular. Okay. Generally, employment needs to be by a sponsoring employer. So an employer who knows that you are doing this for academic credit agrees to participate in the academic nature of the activity, provide reports to a supervising professor, that sort of thing. So it's approved by a designated school official. The approval shows up on your I-20, that support document to get your visa. That's something that you hang on to the whole time you're here because it shows all of the ways that you're following the rules of your status. The way it works at different universities varies because it's a combination of fairly limited regulatory or legal language and a whole lot of university policy. And because there's such a wide variety of universities in the US, the way we handle different aspects of academic activities works very differently at different schools. So it's important to know it's going to be different depending on where you go to school. I've already talked about it being available after 1 year in full-time status. Again, graduate students may need to start earlier if it's required. It does require that you get that specific placement or employment set up first. So I can't authorize CPT until I know where you're going, what you're doing, how it relates to your program, that your academic advisor or supervising professor has said, yes, this is an appropriate activity. Here's how it relates to the program, or here's how it's a requirement for this particular class that you're registered in. Okay. So it's very specific to exact activities that are connected to your curriculum, to your program. Generally, for a lot of schools, it is something that you are enrolled for a class or it's an absolute requirement. There's some allow it for Other things, we have one program at our university that it's not connected directly to a class. That's our music program, because music students are expected to perform and teach. That is just how it works in the graduate program for the music school. But any other program, it's either in the catalog, the university catalog, that says what all the requirements for all the programs are, or it's for a particular class. It can vary widely, even at the same school. So there may be some programs at a university that offers a lot of opportunities. There may be some programs it's not allowed at all, because there's no way for it to be built into the curriculum. Okay. And because we, as universities, have to tell the U.S. government, the Department of Homeland Security, which programs have CPT in advance, it can be pretty strictly regulated. Generally, it is 20 hours a week while school is in session, but that does depend a little bit on the program you're in. If you have student teaching, which is CPT, even though it's not paid, then that may be a full-time opportunity while classes are in session, because that is your curriculum. That's your academic activity that term. Some schools allow it during the breaks. Some do not. Some require that you be registered for a class if you're going to do it during the break, in which case you're generally allowed to do it full-time as long as there's an academic reason for doing it. And then generally, the big difference here between CPT and OPT for when you're allowed to do it is CPT is only available while you are still a student. You cannot do it after your studies. So it's important for planning purposes to know that once classes end in your last term, you're not really eligible anymore. So the general process: find an opportunity, get a letter of employment, talk to your academic advisor, get their okay, and then you come to the international office and say, here are all my CPT things, please authorize me. If everything makes sense, then your DSO gives you a new I-20 that says you are allowed to do CPT at this place between these dates, okay, full-time or part-time. So it's a pretty general application process because it depends on your individual academic program. Okay. Optional practical training, on the other hand, the reason I have optional underlined is it's maybe something you do, maybe you don't. It's not required for your academic program, but it helps you. It's something you can apply for whether or not you've finished your studies, okay? In general, for optional practical training, there is a total of 12 months available at each higher level of academic studies, as long as you have not done 365 days of full-time curricular practical training. If you do 365 days of curricular practical training full-time, you cannot do optional practical training at that level. So for optional practical training, you can do it before you finish your studies. And if you're at a university that doesn't allow CPT or has no opportunities, or maybe you're just in a program that doesn't have any opportunities, you could apply for optional practical training before you finish your studies. Most students save it for after they finish their studies for a couple of reasons. One, a lot of CPT opportunities exist at a lot of universities, so it's not really necessary. But the big reason is because you only have 12 months. You can break that up into segments, but each segment that you apply for, that application goes to the U.S. government. It's going to cost you $410 to apply for, and that cost goes up every few years. And it's going to take at least 3 months to get an approval back. So if you have an internship that you want to start next week, optional practical training is not going to work for you, because the U.S. government, I have never ever seen an application go faster than 2 months. And that was basically a miracle. In some cases, it's taken 5 or 6 months to approve. So it's not a fast process, and it's expensive. But if you save your 12 months for after you graduate, you can use a year of optional practical training to get experience in your field, to get work experience in the U.S., which can help you back home, or it can help you maybe get a more permanent U.S. job. So you can do pre-completion before you complete your studies, and you could use your whole 12 months. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. I've never had a student actually do it. But most students save it until afterwards when they can use their whole 12 months at once. You don't have to have an offer of employment like you do for CPT. You can work for any employer, unlike CPT. The job itself has to directly relate to your studies. So that's where things are very similar, is it's still practical training in your field. It's just a lot more options as to who you work for. You can work for any employer as long as the job itself actually directly relates to your studies. And then there's STEM extension. So STEM is a special provision that allows an additional 24 months of practical training if you are in very specific STEM fields. You're allowed to do this 2 times in your life, but they have to be for 2 separate degrees, and you have to be doing post-completion practical training in order to apply for the STEM extension. So if you use up all of your regular OPT while you're still a student, even if you're doing a STEM program, you won't have the opportunity to do that STEM extension. Okay, so generally you have to have been here for a full year in F1 status. Your international student and scholar advisor has to give you an endorsed I-20, but we can't authorize it. That has to go to the US government with quite a few application pages. You don't have to have an offer of employment. Generally, if you're doing pre-completion, you're only allowed to do 20 hours a week while school's in session. You can apply for full-time during official breaks, but those are 2 separate applications, each of which is going to take 3 months, possibly more, to get an answer back, and each of which is going to cost you a separate application fee to the US government. So again, we don't really endorse doing it before you finish your studies for the most part, because we don't like you to spend that kind of money. You can do it before or after you finish your studies, but generally not recommended before, and you can break it into parts. General process, you get an I-20 with an endorsement from me or from Olga, and when that happens depends on certain things. You submit an I-765 form and a bunch of other paperwork to the US government, and then you wait a really long time, like sometimes a really, really long time for approval. And if you're doing it after you finish your studies, there's really not much you can do if you finished your studies. You kind of just have to sit twiddling your thumbs. You're not allowed to work on campus or off campus until you have that authorization. Once you get approved, you have to work in your field of studies. If it's post-completion, you have to work in your field of studies for at least 20 hours a week to be considered employed. And the work should be both in your field of studies and appropriate to the degree you earned. So it shouldn't be really basic work if you got a PhD in a particular field, okay? But you can work for any employer anywhere in the US. So if you have always wanted to live in Colorado, but you got your degree in New York, you can come to Colorado for post-completion OPT. So we've kind of talked through most of this. I won't go over this in detail, but pre-completion, generally if CPT is not available on your campus at the university you go to, that's maybe when you want to think about using pre-completion OPT. But because it's expensive and it's slow and there are lots of restrictions, we don't generally recommend it. Also, if you apply for it and they authorize it and you have lost that job opportunity or didn't find one, you don't get that time back. So that's important to know as well. For post-completion, there are some timing things. You have to apply between the 90 days before you graduate and the 60 days after you graduate. And that's USCIS must receive the application within those dates. If it's a little bit before or a little bit after, they will deny you. Sometimes they will take your money and deny you. So you want to be very careful about your timing. Your employment for post-completion has to start within, or at least your permission has to start within the 60 days after you finish your studies, which may or may not mean you have graduated, especially for graduate students. Full-time employment is required to maintain your F1 status. To follow the rules of your visa, you're allowed 90 days of unemployment time during your 12 months of OPT. So That might mean finding a job right away that's a short-term job, and then it takes you 60 days to find something else. Then you've used 60 of your days, and then that's a short-term job, and it takes you 10 more days. You've used 70 of your total days, and so on. When you're not employed, that includes weekends and holidays, which is just a good thing to know. Any employment during OPT must be reported through CVIS, the immigration database that I use to issue your I-20. Okay. But employment options are very broad. You can have more than one employer. You can be paid, you can be unpaid, you can have several employers at the same time. You can do casual employment, again, as long as it's attached to your field of studies. You can have a bunch of sequential employers, so one after the other. You can have a combination of all of those things. So you have a lot of choices during OPT, which is really nice. You can work and live anywhere in the U.S. while you're on OPT. You are allowed to travel in and out of the U.S., but you have to keep in mind those 90 days of unemployment, and it can be more difficult to get a new U.S. visa to come back in. There's some other rules that you would get told once you apply at the school you work with to do this. You're still an F1 student according to the U.S. government. So if you're a UNC student, you're still mine the whole time you're on OPT. You still let me know where you're living. You still let me know where you're working. We're still in contact. I still have to sign documents for you. So you remain connected to your university throughout the OPT period. And I think we've covered all of that. Okay, so then STEM. STEM is that special 24-month period. It's very specific degrees that it's attached to. So when you are doing it, it has to be that you got a certain kind of degree from a certain kind of university that is approved by the Department of Homeland Security to issue immigration documents. They have to have been approved at the time you got the degree there. So it gets very complex. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on STEM. If you are planning on a STEM degree, it's good to know if the STEM degree you're planning on, how it's reported at the university you're planning on going to, because a degree with the same name at two different universities can be reported to the U.S. government in different ways depending on the curriculum. So knowing if it's a STEM eligible program at that school or STEM extension eligible program, it's a good thing to ask when you're applying. There are some special provisions that make it a little bit more difficult. You do have to have a job offer. You have to have an employer that qualifies. So they have to meet certain requirements themselves. They have to create a training plan for you. They have to sign off on things. They have to agree to inspection sites by the U.S. government. So it does get more complex, and not all employers are willing to do the STEM extension process with you. Most universities will help an employer through that process, but because they have to make corporate decisions, sometimes they're just not willing, okay? Generally, the process is that you must be in a period of post-completion OPT. So if you used it all as pre-completion, you can't do STEM extension. But you can use a STEM degree, a prior STEM degree. So if you got a STEM degree as a bachelor's degree, get a master's degree in the US as well, and then go on to a STEM extension, that's actually possible. You can do it up to twice in your life, but they have to be two different STEM degrees, both in the US and each at a higher level. The application process is very similar to regular OPT or pre-completion or post-completion, but you do have to prove that you have that specialty degree. You have to prove that the school that issued the degree is qualifying as well. You have to prove that you have the right kind of employer, and you have to have that training plan in place, and it's several pages long, so there is quite a bit to it. If you apply on time, then your work authorization is actually automatically extended for 180 days, which again tells you something about how long the U.S. government sometimes takes to process those applications. If you don't apply on time, you simply aren't approved, and that's it, you're done. You either need to go on to a different degree or go home or do something else. So a lot of students want to know what happens after they finish OPT. Can they stay in the US and work? Sometimes yes. So a really common pathway for international students is F1 to OPT, maybe STEM OPT if their degrees qualify, and then to H1B. So H1B is a specialty occupation, and there's something called the cap gap, that if your employer files a H1B petition for you and a change of status at the same time, which is kind of technical, and it has to be your employer, and it's filed on time, and it's filed while you're still in OPT, you may be able to bridge the time between when your H1B would start and your OPT and still maybe even have work permission. All of that depends a little bit on timing, but knowing that there is a cap gap, literally there's a gap and a cap over it, that can be really helpful to know about, especially as you plan the timing of your OPT when you are getting close to graduation. So an H1B is for specialty occupation. You have to have at least a bachelor's degree in a specific field to get the job. So the job itself has to qualify. You have to qualify for the job, and the employer has to file. Lots of universities hire H1Bs. H1Bs from universities are not subject to the cap. In most years, there's only 65,000 H1Bs available, plus an additional 20,000 for people with U.S. master's degrees or higher. And that can be a limitation for folks, but if you are working for a university, universities are not subject to the cap. So we can apply for more H1Bs than, say, Google can. Okay, so when you're thinking about employment after graduation, that's a helpful thing to know. H1B record keeping and application processes are really complex. Not going to lie about that. Not all employers want to deal with it. They often have to hire outside attorneys to do the work for them. So it is not always something that they want to do. They also have to agree to pay either the prevailing wage or the actual wage they pay, which is ever higher. And so sometimes companies can't afford it. They also have to buy you a plane ticket home if they fire you or have to let you go before your H1B approval period is up. So there's a lot of complexities to H1Bs that mean not all employers will do it, but universities do it a lot. And so that might be a good opportunity, especially if you're going into a PhD program. So just a couple of final notes, and I know I have talked a lot, so hopefully you saved up your questions for me. A couple things to know. Generally, employment in the U.S. is not going to be a good way to finance your studies here. There just aren't enough legal opportunities available, and the U.S. government gets very, very upset if people are working without authorization. Any kind of formal employment in the U.S. does require that you get a social security number for tracking purposes. It's really a tax ID number in some ways here. Some employers don't know the difference between that and work permission, and so occasionally there are some confusing things where you think it's okay to work because the employer said it was okay, but it's really not because the employer just saw your social security number and said, oh, okay. And then it's important to know that any US-based income does carry a tax burden. So you do have to file taxes for each calendar year you are in the US. Even certain kinds of scholarships, if they pay for room or board meals, then they may be taxable as well. But income earned from an employer is definitely taxable, and you want to factor that in to your earning ability. So I am ready for questions if you have them. Olga, is there anything I missed?
No, I don't believe so. You've covered it pretty well, and there are a lot of nuances. There's lots of unpacking to do. We're here to answer any questions, any comments, and has the information we presented similar to what you already know, or have you learned something new today that you may not have known before? We'd love to hear from you.
Great, thank you. Thank you for such an informative presentation. While we are waiting for questions, I'm going to share the question that I myself get quite often from our students, is the situation that some students are employed part-time in Ukraine, let's say, teaching online or doing some freelance work. So when they go to the US, they are curious whether they can keep this part-time occupation.
Shall I answer that, Olga, or would you like
Yes.
to?
Now go
Okay.
ahead.
So no, unfortunately not. So the way U.S. employment law works is that what governs is where you are physically. So not where your employer is. So if your feet are on the ground in the United States, U.S. employment law applies, and that means you do have those restrictions no matter who you're working for. So it is not legal to be working for an employer remotely outside the U.S., unfortunately.
Thank you. I don't see any questions in the comments box, and that is actually good. That means that everything was super clear. So again, Olga, Kara, thank you so much for joining today and sharing this super important information. And if the questions do appear after this presentation, is there a contact or a way how the viewers or the students can reach out to you with the questions? Or is it better to arrange it in that way that they reach out to us and we reach out to you?
So one of the challenges with this, definitely please connect with us, and it should be on the screen now. One of the challenges is some of these things are very specific to the university a student wants to attend. And so I can answer any question that students have about UNC and how CPT or OPT works. And I can give really good general answers. I have been doing this for a very long time, 18 years. And I help teach immigration to other immigration advisors in the country. So I know it all pretty well. But if you're planning on going to a different university, I can't tell you how CPT is going to work there because it's so specific to that university. So I'm really happy to answer general questions, and please feel free to reach out. Be patient. I get a lot of email. But also know that I can give you specific UNC answers, or I can give you very, very broad answers to general questions that may not apply at the university that you go to. So it's important to know to reach out to advisors where if you've already applied and you're planning on coming, that's who you need to reach out to. If you haven't decided, then we can help you with admissions to UNC. We can help you with immigration for UNC. We're great resources for lots of things.
Perfect. Thank you, Kara. Thank you so much to all the viewers for joining today. Big thanks to our speakers. Have a great day.